Long before Australia had a written language, long before ships arrived from Europe, long before the coastline on any modern map existed, the elders were already describing it. They spoke of a time when their people could walk to islands that today sit far out in open ocean. They described hunting kangaroo and emu across wide plains that are now buried under salt water. In the Gulf of Carpentaria, they remembered home islands that were once part of a single peninsula, back when a person could roam that whole stretch of land without ever needing a boat. None of this was told as fantasy, it was told as memory, as something that happened to real people in a real place their ancestors could stand and point to. For most of the last century, science had one word for stories like these: myth, poetic inventions, the kind of thing every culture builds to explain the landscape around it. So why, in 2015, did a geographer and a linguist stake their reputations on the opposite idea? That these were not myths at all, but some of the most accurate eyewitness accounts ever passed between human beings. To understand how that is even possible, we have to start with how a story like this survives at all. Aboriginal people have lived in Australia continuously for something like 50,000 years, and by some estimates far longer. In all that time, they never developed writing. They kept no books and no written archives. Nothing was carved into stone with a date on it. Everything a community knew about its land, its law, and its past was carried in spoken form, in story, in song, in dance, and in ceremony. To a modern ear, that sounds fragile. We know how fast a message falls apart when it passes mouth to mouth. Play a game of telephone across a single room and the sentence is unrecognizable by the end. Stretch that across 100 generations, and surely nothing accurate could possibly remain. But that comparison misses something important about how this particular kind of knowledge was handled. These were not casual campfire tales that anyone could retell however they liked. Certain stories were tied to the land itself, and telling them correctly was an obligation, bound up in kinship and in what many Aboriginal groups call the law. There were rules about who could tell which story, and there were senior knowledge keepers whose responsibility was to hold the correct version and pass it down without drift. Much of this sat inside what is often called the dreaming, the vast body of law, history, and origin that ties each group to its country. Knowledge was also mapped onto the land through song lines, routes across the landscape, where the words of a song matched the places you passed as you traveled. A story was not floating free in someone's imagination. It was attached to real ground, and the ground was always there to check it against. If you value this kind of history, the kind that was never written down and still turned out to be true, take a second to tell me where in the world you are watching from. It genuinely helps me to keep researching stories like this one. The linguist behind the study we are about to examine described a mechanism that sounds almost like an engineered system. Across generations, relatives would cross-check each other's tellings. If a younger person got a detail wrong, an older relative was expected to correct it. That constant checking worked like error correction in a machine, catching mistakes before they could compound. Add in the way important knowledge was locked into ceremony, repeated in a fixed form again and again, and you have something much closer to a living archive than a rumor. Think about that for a second. A culture with no writing at all built a method for keeping information stable across time, on purpose. And that method is the only reason the next part of this story is possible. In 2015, a marine geographer named Patrick Nunn from the University of the Sunshine Coast teamed up with a linguist named Nicholas Reed from the University of New England. Nunn had spent his career studying how coastlines change. Reed had spent his studying how languages and stories carry meaning across time. Together, they spent 3 years on a single question. Could Aboriginal stories about the sea be describing real events? And if so, how old were those events? They gathered accounts from 21 locations, spread around the entire coastline of Australia. Every one of them shared the same core, a time when the land reached further out, when places that are now sea were once dry, and when the water came in and never went back. Then they did something clever. For each story, they worked out the minimum depth of water that would have to be removed for the story to be literally true. If a story said people once walked to an island, they measured how deep the channel is today. That depth told them how far the sea would have had to drop for the walk to be possible. And because scientists already know, in fine detail, how sea levels rose after the last ice age, that depth could be converted into a date. Here is the backdrop that makes those dates land. At the peak of the last ice age, around 20,000 years ago, so much of the planet's water was locked up in ice sheets that the sea sat roughly 120 meters lower than it does now. Australia was bigger. Vast plains of dry land stretched out where there is now open water. As the ice melted, the ocean climbed, swallowing that land until it settled at today's level about 7,000 years ago. Any story that describes that lost land as dry has to be older than the flooding that erased it. So what did the 21 stories actually say? Near modern Melbourne, the shallow waters of Port Phillip Bay were once a hunting ground. Local groups told of a time when the bay was dry, when people caught kangaroo and possum on ground that is now under the sea, and when the Yarra River flowed out through a different mouth entirely. This was not just recorded by anthropologists a few years ago. In 1859, a man named William Hull told a committee of the colonial government in Victoria that the local people said their forebears remembered when the bay was open country, where they could catch plenty of kangaroo and possum. Nunn and Reid calculated that those stories describe a coastline from somewhere between roughly 7,800 and 9,350 years ago. Further east in Gippsland, the memory came wrapped in a warning. The story tells of ancestors living on land that is now underwater until some children found a sacred object meant only for men and carried it back to show the women at camp. The moment they did, the land broke apart and the sea rushed in and drowned it. Strip away the moral lesson stitched onto it, and what remains is a description of a sudden, permanent flood over lived-in land. On the York Peninsula, stories of Spencer Gulf describe it as dry or marshy before an ancestral being carved it open, in some versions using a giant kangaroo bone to dig the channel that let the water in. If those stories describe the flooding of the outer edge of the Gulf, which today sits about 50 meters below the surface, they could be as much as 12,000 years old. And near Kangaroo Island, the Ngarrindjeri people tell of an ancestor named Ngurunderi, whose wives fled from him across to the island. In the tradition, they crossed mostly on foot, along a strip of ground or a line of boulders where a person could walk or wade. Furious, Ngurunderi raised the waters and turned the women into rock, the islands you can still see standing in that channel today. The passage they supposedly walked is now open sea. In the Gulf of Carpentaria, the same kind of event survives as the tale of Garngur, a seagull woman who dragged her raft back and forth across the neck of a peninsula, letting the sea pour through until the high ground was cut off into the Wellesley Islands. It has a character and a bit of drama in it, but underneath the drama is a plain physical claim. This land was once joined to the mainland, and then the water separated it. On the far side of the country, off the coast near Perth, groups described the islands now known as Rottnest, Karnak, and Garden Island as places that were once connected to the shore, back when a person could reach them without crossing deep water. Every one of those crossings is now submerged. None of these groups were in contact with each other in any way that could explain the pattern. They sat at opposite ends of a continent, speaking different languages, and yet they told versions of the same event. Dry land, rising water, a border that moved inland and stayed there. And when the maps of the seafloor were laid beside the stories, the depths lined up. Nunn and Reid concluded that these memories are somewhere between about 7,000 and 13,000 years old. That is the version you have probably never heard. and it breaks a rule that scientists had treated as settled for a very long time. For decades, the mainstream position among historians was blunt. Oral tradition, they argued, could carry a story reliably for perhaps 800 years before it decayed into legend. Beyond that, the details were assumed to be lost, replaced, or simply invented. A memory reaching back 7,000 years, let alone 13,000, was treated as flatly impossible. It sat outside what human culture was thought capable of. So the honest objection to Nunn and Reed writes itself. How could any story survive 300 or 400 generations of retelling without collapsing into nonsense? For most researchers, that question alone was enough to file these traditions under folklore and move on. Nunn and Reed were asking everyone to reconsider a limit that had felt as solid as any in the field. Before we get to how they answered the skeptics, and to the other discoveries that started backing them up, one quick thing. While this argument played out in academic journals, the Australian stories were quietly stopping being alone in the world. But before those other cases arrived, the skeptics had reasonable points to make, and they still do. The alternatives they offer are fair ones. Maybe the resemblance is coincidence, since flood stories appear in cultures all over the planet. Maybe people simply looked at the drowned land, read its shape, and built a story backward to explain it, rather than remembering anything at all. Maybe the dates are being taken too literally. Nunn and Reed do not pretend to have shut the door on those ideas, but they point to something the alternatives struggle with. It is the consistency. These are not vague tales of a great flood. They name specific places, specific channels a person could cross, specific plains where specific animals were hunted, specific hills that became islands, and across 21 separate locations told by peoples who never met, the accounts agree with one another and agree with the sea floor. Coincidence has a hard time producing that. Backward invention has a hard time staying that accurate across an entire continent. It is worth being clear about what is and is not being claimed here. Nobody is arguing that these are word-for-word transcripts, or that every detail is literal. Stories pick up characters and lessons as they travel through time, and a giant kangaroo bone carving out a gulf is plainly not a geological report. The claim is narrower and stranger. Underneath the characters and the lessons sits a stable core of physical observation, and that core survived long enough to be checked against the planet itself. You can strip away the seagull woman and the angry ancestor and still be left with an accurate statement about where the coast used to be. Australia may also be genuinely unusual here. For tens of thousands of years, its people lived in relative isolation, with long stretches of cultural continuity and few of the upheavals that shatter oral records elsewhere. Combine that isolation with a storytelling system deliberately built to resist drift, and you have close to ideal conditions for a memory to survive an almost unimaginable stretch of time. And the sea level stories turned out not to stand alone. In northern Queensland, traditions describe the eruptions of volcanoes that formed a cluster of crater lakes. Eruptions geologists date to more than 10,000 years ago. In the Northern Territory and beyond, oral accounts of objects falling from the sky have led modern scientists to meteorite sites they might never have connected to a witnessed event. In Tasmania, a separate team has argued that some traditions may reach back into the last ice age as well. And across the water in New Zealand, geologists have begun treating Maori accounts of earthquakes and tsunamis as records of real disasters. One case can be a fluke. A whole pattern of them, spread across a continent and past it, is much harder to wave away. Bit by bit, the idea that human memory hits a hard wall at 800 years has started to look less like a law and more like an assumption nobody had bothered to test. And once that wall comes down, a much larger door swings open behind it. Because if a spoken story can carry an accurate memory across 10,000 years, we are forced into a harder question. What else is sitting inside these traditions that we have quietly filed under mythology? Aboriginal stories are full of details that modern listeners have long treated as pure invention. Giant animals that no longer walk the earth, a sky that looked different, land that changed its shape. For generations, the safe assumption was that these were symbols, or dreams, or imagination. But Australia really was home to enormous megafauna that died out thousands of years ago. Its landscapes really did shift. Its coastlines really did move. Some of what has always sounded like fantasy may be exactly what it claims to be. Something seen, held in trust, and handed carefully down. This does not mean every story is a literal record, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Much of this remains genuinely contested. Dating a spoken memory is hard, and some of these traditions may turn out to be younger, or reshaped, or partly symbolic after all. The point was never that the mystery is now solved. The point is that a whole category of evidence we spent a century brushing aside has earned a serious second look. Researchers have even suggested that memories of similar depth might survive in other old, stable cultures around the world, and that we have simply never thought to test them the way these were tested. If that is right, the record of the human past runs longer and deeper than our textbooks admit, and a great deal of it was never written down at all. There is something humbling buried in that. The civilizations that wrote everything down, that carved their rulers into stone and filled great libraries, still lost most of their oldest records to fire and time. And a people who never wrote a single book kept a report so precise that we can now lay it beside the ocean floor and watch it hold. So the real question this leaves behind is not whether one story about a drowned coast happens to be true. It is how much real history is still out there in plain sight, dismissed as legend, waiting for the maps and the instruments to finally catch up to what the elders had been saying the whole time. The elders never set out to keep a scientific record. They were doing something older, and in its way, more demanding. They were remembering a coastline their ancestors walked, plains their ancestors hunted, and the day the sea came in and took all of it. They held that memory steady for thousands of years, long enough for the rest of the world to invent writing, forget most of what it wrote, and finally build the tools that could prove them right. If a story like this changes what you think counts as history, that is the whole point. So tell me in the comments, do you think these traditions and the drowned coastlines are two records of the same real event? Or is the science reading too much into an old story? I read the replies, and the sharpest ones often become the next video. And if you want more forgotten history that turned out to be true, the video on screen is a good place to head next. As always, we'll see you in the past.